Hello and welcome to Clergy in Collar Getting Coffees. Today I am joined by my special guest, the Reverend Dr. John Welch, who is the senior pastor of the 6th Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. He's CEO of Flourishing Communities, the director of strategic partnerships and program development for Pittsburgh Pastoral Institute. Prior to that, John spent almost 14 years as the vice president of Student Services, Community Engagement, and Dean of Students at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And beyond that, he has done strategic business planning, conducted seminars, training church leaders, physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals in ethics and burnout and moral distress and long-term care and implicit bias and institutional racism. There's not a hat you don't wear, John. And he is currently on the nonprofit board and chair of the board of directors of the, I'm going to say that wrong. How do you say that? Gamaliel?
Yep.
Gamaliel
Real. Mhm.
Network. You are a native of Pittsburgh. And beyond the other things I've mentioned, you hold a bachelor's of science in chemical engineering and economics and a master's of divinity and PhD in healthcare. So, welcome.
Thank
That
you.
that is a lot. A lot of very good, rich stuff there, which we could probably speak for hours on any of those topics. And we know each other because of our work on the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission. That's how we have met for the work that we do for the PCUSA. And one of the things that I have learned in the time that we have known each other is that you are a lover of jazz.
I am. I love music. I love jazz. Yes.
Yeah. And that you and your wife take these jazz cruises. Now,
Yes.
when did that start and how badly did COVID mess up the trips?
Uh, well, COVID definitely did postpone. Now we've not done these cruises long. We've just finished our second, which probably had it not been for COVID, may have been our would have been our fourth perhaps. But our first cruise, I believe, was in 2019. Yeah, it was in 2019. And that was this was the Dave Cos cruise. And the 2019 cruise was to the Baltic. So we started in Copenhagen, Denmark, and then traveled to Sweden and Estonia, Russia, and forget now the fourth country where we went, Finland. And it was nice. I mean, at first, I thought it was going to be cold. We went in May, but the temperature was beautiful, the sights were beautiful, the music was outstanding. I didn't want to get off the boat.
I, I was gonna say you get this like amazing soundtrack to the beautiful scenery. Is that like
Yeah, it's the best vacation I've ever had. And so there's another cruise, jazz cruise that and it's not the only. There are several, but the other famous or one artist that I love is Brian Culbertson. So Brian Culbertson has a cruise that does the Mediterranean, and we've not been on that, but I think we're going to stick with Dave Koz. We love the artists that he has, and he doesn't just have jazz artists; he has R&B artists. He'll have a comic on there, and so it's just a lot of fun and just a good time.
now how does like I'm always interested to know how people found out that information to begin with. Were you just like what is jazz and my love of traveling or like what was that Google search like or was it your wife who was doing it or like a friend or who like how does one cuz I until you had mentioned it I didn't know that such specifically themed cruises existed and I have since learned you can basically cruise on about any theme you could possibly think of.
Yeah, a friend of ours did the cruise and told us about it, and we wait listed, and that's how we got on the 2018. We were someone had canceled, and so we were taken off the wait list. And the wild thing was the day that we got on the boat, the next year's cruise was sold out already.
Whoa.
And so it's like an automatic wait list, you know. So you have an opportunity as so for those who were already booked and not waitlisted, they knew about the upcoming cruise before we did, and so they were able to sign up ahead of time. And so now that we've been on two, we're already aware of upcoming, or we're in fact we're already booked for next year's cruise, which will be traveling to Greece and Turkey and Israel and Egypt.
Wow.
So, so yeah, like I said, I don't want to get off the boat. You know, I don't really. I mean, it's great to see these places, but the music and just the fellowship is so awesome. It's like I don't want it to stop. It's like let's
Yeah.
keep moving. Let's go around in circles if we have to.
So they could literally, I mean, really they don't have to move at all. You could stay docked the whole time with everything and be perfectly just at ease.
Oh, I would, as long as they keep. I mean, so I pastor a Baptist church.
Yeah.
So, you know, we got rid of the whole, you know, no drinking policy out of the.
Okay, so you're not a dry church.
So I'm not a dry church. So as long as they have the bar open,
Yeah.
I'm good to go. And food to
I
eat,
would
I want to talk about, so I'm fine.
So I like to tell people that the church I serve is dry, but the people who go to it are not. Like it's not. So like we don't do it here because like, you know, Presbyterian polity, if we serve wine at communion or whatever, then you have to serve whatever. You have to
Yeah.
serve grape juice and all that stuff. It's just easier to serve the grape juice. And so it's about ease. And then the other bit is always about liability. So but they so it's a dry church, but it's not a dry congregation by any stretch of the imaginations.
I think we'll find too many dry congregations.
No,
So,
I don't think we do either. Uh, but the thing that I'm curious about, and I know you don't, you even mentioned you don't only just love jazz, and you have at least two of your children are also musicians.
yeah, three of my four are musicians.
Amazing. Um, and so jazz isn't the only language, but would you say that music is definitely one of those places where you can hear hear and feel God's presence, but maybe even God's voice sounds like a an instrument of some kind or a piece of music to you? Is that ever been an experience, I guess?
Yeah, you know, I think the divine and music is inextricably linked. You know, and so you know we find that I think the first reference to actually his effect was you know David playing for Saul, and but you know there's scientific evidence that music actually travels into a subconscious human state that nothing else does, and so so it has the ability to speak to us in ways that just human language does not. So so that's why I say you know we cannot, I don't think we can separate that from the divine. And the same token, you know, it can also be an instrument of evil. So anything that can penetrate the subconscious, and we can't take for granted, you know, evil forces and the impact that it has, you know, on humanity. So so yeah, to answer your question, I think it is ways, and I firmly believe it is ways. In fact, it has been sort of my entree into ministry. Music was, and so so I don't limit myself to jazz, of course, gospel, but even classical music, which is where I got my start anyway, was in
Where
classical music.
was in classical music.
Mhm.
Now, playing or listening or both?
Both. More
Okay.
playing and then evolved to listening, because the playing of the classical kind of faded away and the gospel kind of took over.
Okay.
But
And what did you play?
piano,
Okay.
piano and the classical, and then moved to wind instruments in high school, and then went back to the piano and keyboard and organ in post college years.
Okay. And do you still play?
Only when I have to.
Now, is there a piece of like So there's sometimes like with the church where sometimes I choose music that my congregation can't stand. Uh and now sometimes I don't like it either. Like I just like to try it out, see what happens. And so I'm a fan of doing that. I think it's good to keep us all on our toes cuz I think if we just sing what we're familiar with or play what we're familiar with, then we don't learn about this new favorite that we might discover or a piece that we or like I'm never going to touch that piece of music again. That can be done by a choir, people who rehearsed it, but that is not for a general congregational sing. But I often say like the rhythm or the speed at which my soul hums sometimes is not, it's not a dirge. My soul does not hum at a dirge like pace. It has there's a lot more rhythm and stuff to that. So like where do you feel like those what are some of those pieces of music that have most penetrated your soul, if you were just to highlight just a handful? Or
Oh man, yeah. So,
because I know it's a big question for a music lover.
well, I love some of the soundtracks of Star Wars movies.
Yes.
I mean, it's that deep, rich, and I love, even though in my Baptist church and even in my Presbyterian church, I did not have access to the or regular access to the pipe organ
Yeah.
richness and the sound of a pipe organ. I mean, those sort of things really, dig deep uh,
Mm-hmm.
into my soul. So, as opposed to, um, the typical gospel music and even some of the jazz, I think for me, they are more um, kind of on the surface of my spirit, but the deep penetrations for me are more with the orchestrations, the orchestral music, and and as I mentioned, like the pipe organ within a worship setting. So I mean, it just, anything that makes my body shudder, I just it
Yeah.
penetrates my spirit, So
Yeah. I mean I understand that. It's really fascinating. I mean, I usually ask people, like, I'm always curious to know what's like an instrument or a sound, and you referenced the pipe organ might be one of these for you, but like that you really feel like when you hear that being played well, that it really like hits a place that you can't even articulate. Like for me, that's the harmonica. I don't play the harmonica, but my husband does. But that for me is an instrument that, for whatever reason, when I hear it in the background of a song or someone's just playing it, um, I really just it just hits me in a spot that that other instruments don't. I might like a lot. I like a lot of the tonal sounds of many instruments, but the harmonica touches a place that I can't even put my finger on. So is the pipe organ that for you, or is it another instrument? I mean, it might be several.
yeah, it's several. I mean, the pipe organ definitely in the worship setting. I love, so if there's an ensemble of baritone saxophones, or there's even the trombone and French horn, more so the trombones. So the lower register instruments I
Yeah.
really like. One of
Well,
the
you have a lower register instrument there, John. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
it's singing baritone and bass over the years. So I guess kind of maybe one reason why I have the affinity to those things. But those instruments, and even so, as far as the percussion instruments, the timpani, I like, as opposed to a bass drum. Bass drum and
Yeah.
marching bands don't really do nothing for me. But
It's that the timpani has another well, it's more of a Barry sound than a bass sound anyway, but I think
yeah,
but
yeah. Um, and so yeah, there's different instruments. The one that I don't really care for is the oboe. It kind of sounds like a whining child. So You know.
That it's the piccolo for me.
Yeah, yeah,
It gets too high
yeah,
that I'm like I can't. It's like I shouldn't be able to hear that. I feel like
yeah.
feels
That's kind of in the same category for me. The flute I can do with the piccolo, not so much, and the oboe, nah. So, but it's and since I played clarinet, that was kind of like I was near the piccolo
oh, it's
section. I
like
mean,
a cousin,
piccolo
right?
section, yeah. So, but yeah, but I like deep, rich sounds, and so yeah, those instruments. I can't think of. There's another one that I really the the probably a tuba section.
Mm,
But I love horns though.
yeah.
I love horns. So groups like Earth, Wind, and Fire, or what was the other one? I'm blanking on their names because it'll probably come to me. But I love horn sections. I love good bands,
Hmm.
and that's all. Of course, with jazz, you got a nice band.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you'd hope so. Uh, now one of like I we've talked a little bit about like I love stand up comedy as well, but one of the people who I really appreciate is Dave Chappelle, and I like the way he thinks there's a lot of similarity between jazz and good stand up comedy. About like the timing and sort of like the stories that it tells or whatever. And I recently just saw a clip of him introducing, um, he talked about that. I don't remember what it was for right now, but he was talking about his love of jazz and like musicians and the similarity between stand-up comics. So then he was introducing his favorite stand-up comedians, but he said it like, let me introduce you to some of my favorite jazz musicians, right? And it was people like Richard Pryor and Red Fox and Eddie Murphy and some of these other comedians. I think it was for the African American Museum dedications. So it was a while ago. It's like an old clip. I don't know how I stumbled upon it, but I mean, you mentioned like even on these cruises that there's R&B and there's jazz and there's stand-up comedians. Do you see a connection in the storytelling aspect of like, and then does that tie into the power of the biblical storytelling?
I would agree with him. I didn't hear that clip from him, but I would agree that there is a similarity based on the timing aspect and the ability to, as a comic, you want to, and as a preacher, you want to tell a story, you want to carry your audience. You don't want them dropping off at any given point of your delivery. So, you want them
Right.
kind of hanging on, waiting to hear what you're going to say. And so you have that in addition to the improvisation element, which you have in jazz and you have in comedy. Although, of course, with comedians, they typically rehearse. They know what they're going to say because, but there was that one show that had Wayne Brady and these other comics. It was like
Oh yeah.
right. So, these were all improvisational acts. They were all comics, and so, you have that, um, you have those similar elements, I think, between jazz and comedy. And although there may be very little improvisation, I wouldn't say little improvisation in preaching, you have those extemporaneous preachers who kind of have a sense of what they're going to say. And those who say, they're really depending on the spirit, they might say they're, using improv, but I don't know. I'm not one like that. I need a manuscript
Yep. Me
uh,
too.
to tell my story. And every now and then, I may, insert something that I had not inserted, but something that came to me in the moment. So yeah, I see similarities there, and
Yeah,
it's
and because sometimes you have to, based on if you're like preaching from the pulpit. At least I find if I'm like something isn't hitting, or when something is right, then if it is hitting, you want to draw, you want to bring that energy out more, and if it's not, you're like, oh, I must have missed a note that was important. I forgot. What is it? And you go back and you have to try to pick it up so that you get people connected again. I do think that's something that happens in the pulpit, and I, like you, only do that. I only feel comfortable doing that when I have a manuscript as an outline or as a guide, and some of that surprises some of my preacher friends that I'm not more of one of these expert, these off the cuff sort of pastors, but it's not. It makes me too nervous.
Yeah, there's been occasions when I've preached without notes. I mean, I've pre-thought, of course, I've had an outline in my head, but that's not my comfort zone. And so yeah, give me my paper.
So, and to pivot entirely away from what we've sort of been talking about, but with, we in the intro there were so many places in your life, so many areas that are mentioned there that don't seem, some of them don't appear to be related on the surface, but I think that they are. I mean, I think there's a reason they sort of all pair together. But how would you say that your training in ministry and the work you've done in healthcare and even with engineering and economics, like how has that all sort of worked together to make you into a strong pastoral leader? Like how does that work in and through COVID, did knowing so much about healthcare help you or hurt you? Like,
Hmm.
did you know too much, or with the ethics, or did it help you to have conversations and present ideas that maybe other people who've never been in those environments would not have thought of?
That's a great question. So let me first respond by saying that when you look at the things that's highlighted in my bio, there appears to be no logical connection, and to the point where I I was going to say, if you found one, let me know because I don't see it. But clearly, every one of those elements have contributed to me being who I am, both as a consultant, a professor, and a pastor. And so I would say where they've all come together is that they've given me an appreciation and an understanding of systems.
I
And
was going to say the connection I see is efficacy and systems. That's what I see in between all those things. Like that's what I see.
I look at most things from a systematic or systemic perspective, and some of that comes from my engineering background, and some of it comes from the my healthcare. Well, I applied that to my healthcare. It helped me to see that system a lot differently. And then from seminary, seminary allowed me to kind of even look at the theological systems that gave rise to the theologies, the Western theologies that we have, and that sort of has silenced the Eastern theologies, the Eastern religions, and religions from the global South. They've and so everything to me is based on a system for good or for bad.
Right.
And so now, how do I then tell the story? The biblical story, looking at biblical systems and the rise of systems from the ancient Near East perspective timeline, and then how do I overlay that now with the present realities, and how do those systems impact our lives? And so kind of interweaving those things, and coming up with a sermon that helps us to dissect and to apply our faith, our theologies to those things. So
Right.
that's kind of like where all of that kind of comes together for me.
And issues of like ethics and Well, and in the bio too, right? There's a emphasis on ethics, and in some ways, I would assume you'd have to deal with moralities and but how, and then the institutional racism, like how our systems are designed and what intentions our systems were designed with. Like, do you feel like it, having a background in engineering where everything is so precise, helps you to better understand what building blocks you need to give people in order to make those connections to, like, oh no, this system was designed to benefit only this thing. This was the designed outcome. And we could restructure it, diverting it here, right? We can restructure it to make the system benefit, I would say, a broader group of people. Does that help you to do? Is that a way in which you even approach it? I don't even know if that's the way you approach it, because I've never taken one of your lectures.
Well, you're giving me some ideas for some upcoming ones, but yeah, it's so, I consider myself an activist pastor, preacher, and so having spent, the Gamaliel Network is, organization that has 44 different faith-based organizations in different cities across the country, 12 different states. And so we apply our faith, we use our faith to apply pressure, on different situations or, on people in power in order to create different outcomes. And so, of course, increased pressure also increased temperature, which means, right? So some folks ain't going to like that, because it's kind of hot when you do that. So identifying pressure points that's going to affect and have a different outcome is what I do within the organizing world, and what I try to do in the faith-based organizing world. And so my engineering background was more process engineering, and so, well, I mean, a lot of even electrical engineering is a process, because it's about circuitries and things of that nature. So as I try to understand processes, then I can better understand where certain areas within a process can be affected, can be changed to have a different output. So you're always going to have an input. You're always going to have elements that affect the stream that's going to also affect the output, so.
Yeah. And what would you say are some of those places where the church would do better to, and I mean the broader church, I'm not talking about your church specific, but like where we could maybe do a better job at helping to, or beginning to redesign a system that empowers more people, versus perpetuating systems that disempower or disengage people?
Yeah, good question again. So as far as the church, I mean, we understand that we would not exist had it not been for Christ. So have a better understanding of who he is and who he was and where it was, the culture in which he came, and in what he did, what I think would be helpful to know that even, we can't separate Christ without, the stories that sort of foretold him.
Right.
And so it's, shame on us if we don't believe that God is a God of socialism, and so, and this is not to completely, nullify capitalism, but an imbalance where everything is heavily based on capitalism at the neglect of socialism is an imbalanced system. And so when we look at, what God put in place for the people of Israel, in the Deuteronomy codes and stuff, it was a socialist system. And so thus you have Jubilee, and where debts are free. And so we can't forget those. So we can't just rely on the love of Christ and forget about the things that came before him that he was all part of. So having a better understanding of him and the totality of Christ, which includes all of the Old Testament, I think is a one starting point for us. And then with that understanding, we can then get back to what you said earlier before the recording, is that, we have to make sure that those who have everything, those who have so much, don't believe that they received it on their own. They got it based on our contribution to their wealth building, and so it's time for them to find ways to give back and to share some of that wealth. And so and what I find very interesting is, right now I'm starting a Bible study on the 12 minor prophets. That one of the things for which that Israel was heavily criticized for was the corruption of religion, the increase in immorality, and the increase in wealth at the expense of the poor. And so the huge wealth gap, all of those things which we're seeing even today in our own country and globally, the church needs to pay attention to.
Yeah, and accepted it as like that's as though that's somehow the way the system's always been. Where like even in 1970, that's not the way the system was. I mean, there were still many unfair parts of it, but the gap in the wealth gap was not nearly the
Right.
size that the wealth gap is now, and how that affects people. I saw and you reminded me of this. I saw a little sticker recently that said, "Don't sit at the tables that Jesus flipped." And I feel like there are times where that's what you're, in some ways, that's sort of what you're talking about. It's like once I get to a certain amount of comfort in my wealth, even if it's nothing compared to like the wealth of others, it's enough for me to get by and not feel like I'm struggling. Then I just want to like pull up my seat and start sitting down. And in some ways, it's a question of, does Jesus want you to just, is that what you're supposed to do? And who's at that table now? Is it exclusive? Who's invited and who's not invited? If you do that, and so that raises some really interesting questions. So we've never had a year of I don't think a year of jubilees historically ever existed. So what would that look like if you were to declare, right, this is the year of jubilee? I know biblically what it said, but what would that look like in terms of some of those systems then, both in and outside of the church?
I think one for starters is, as I think about it, would be the elimination of student loan debt. That would be a help. Uh,
Yep, yep,
and I mean, we knew this back in early 2000s, that soon after the 2008, after that 2008 economic crisis, it
right.
was it was predicted that the student loan debt was going to be the next crisis. And so we've had 9, 10, 11 years to address it, and we haven't. So anything I think that kind of throttles or thwarts, the ability for somebody to flourish.
That's a great word, by the way.
Correct.
Thwarts. Yeah, yeah.
That
That
needs
that
to be more
yeah.
attention to.
Yes, but that thwarts your ability to flourish. Yeah, that though that's a place to start. It's interesting. I don't know if you have this, but sometimes I have a very well, uh, like I read. There are certain books that I read that I'm grateful that I read them for the knowledge, but I actually didn't like reading them because they made me like morally feel black. Like I don't know how to describe that. And one of them that you just reminded me of was and they turned it into a movie, and I've seen the movie, but I also read the book, was The Big Short. And it was about that housing. Did you see it or read it?
I didn't read. I saw the movie. I didn't read the book, and I saw another Netflix documentary that I actually shared in my business ethics class a few years ago about how that all came about.
Oh, I would be very I probably what is the name? Do you remember the name of that documentary?
I can't, but I'll
Okay.
send it to you.
Okay. Because the thing about it is that obviously in books you can go into greater background and with the people and the characters that you see in the movie. A movie just can't do that if it's not a mini series. A mini series has a chance to do that, but like most of our movies don't. There's stuff that's got to be cut out, or characters that get combined into one character in a movie that are not that are multiple people in a book. Um, but it was like one of these things that made me so like I was like, ugh. It made me a little sick to think about even the sorting out is what gains certain people a mass amount of wealth while literally other people were declaring bankruptcy and people lost their homes and all these sort of things. And then to know that there were people that were throwing up flags or throwing things up and saying that, like, or calling to question to say, why aren't you doing that? And it makes me, why aren't we paying attention to this? And it makes me think, like, as you're prepping for that Bible study about the minor prophets, as part of the role, I mean, that's a huge role that minor prophets played in that, was like alerting people to what was happening, what was coming, what, how maybe they could stop the thing from happening. Do you think we have any current day prophets that you would point to say some of these people or these systems or these groups are maybe doing this, and it would be wise of us to pay them a little more attention?
Yeah. So there are, when you say groups, I would consider groups that have sort of taken on a prophetic role, as like Greenpeace, and uh, some of the other organizations that are really calling us to account, issues that have widespread implications. Now, of course, they're not doing it from a theological perspective, but you think of the role of the prophet was basically to identify facts and tell the truth.
Right.
So, which means that puts you and I both in those categories. Now, unfortunately, we have some folks who are sitting in our congregations that don't want to hear the truth. And
I
I mean,
mean, sometimes, truthfully, I don't want to hear the truth. There are times and moments where it's a hard pill to swallow. I'm like, I changed my mind. I don't want the truth. I want you to lie to me.
well, I mean, think about Amos. I mean, Amos
Yeah.
wasn't considered a prophet. He didn't define himself as one, because you had your schools of prophets, so to speak. He's like, look, hey, I was doing minding my own business, picking sycamores and herding sheep, and the voice of God called me. So so yeah, he like, I don't want to do this, but he says, but how can you not prophesy when God calls, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so as much as you and I may not like the truth, we have to at least put it out there.
Yeah.
And but then again, unfortunately, I think we are in this season where it's not so much that there are some folks who don't want to hear the truth, but there's others who really now can't really discern what truth is, because it has been so
Mm.
affected by, I mean, it's with social media and the fact that you can get information anywhere, you don't know what truth really is. And so that's, I think, is one of the challenges we have as a church, is how do we take facts and really articulate them as truly facts, that unadulterated facts, and then convey them, within, in a message identifying them as truth. And so, and so I think it was Giuliani who said, who raised the question, what is truth? And he was being interrogated a few years back. And then you've got Trump talking about fake news. So then it raises the question, well, what news is truth and what news is not? What news is fake and what news is not?
This is
So,
not right.
so I think that's one of our challenges now is, can we be the purveyors of real truth, and people accept it.
And sometimes I feel like, do we ask enough questions? Like, do we think enough? Has the environment gotten so toxic that we can't even have discourse where we get to sort of um, look at it, shift sort of dig through it to see what actually that kernel of truth might be? Because sometimes you get like just this little bit of truth, and then a whole bunch of twists and turns, right? But I feel like sometimes we don't spend time going, okay, those twists and turns were just like a ruse, right? It was a cunning attempt to trick me. But there is there is this snippet of truth in what is being said, and we could have maybe rich dialogue on that, but I feel like we spend a lot of time instead dialoguing on the junk rather than the essence of the argument or whatever. And that might just be me personally. I don't know what your feelings are on that.
I agree. I mean, our climate now is, much like the wealth gap is worse than it's ever been. Our political climate is the worst. I would venture to say it's probably the worst that it's ever been. There's no middle. Everything is so polarized, and the sad thing is how politics and religion have become so toxic, intertwined in a toxic manner.
Yes.
And so which then unfortunately puts us in a situation where people will heavily say you cannot, there's a separation of church and state. You cannot bring politics into the pulpit. Well, that's the very place where politics is supposed to be, but in a less toxic manner, then again based on truth. And so we're in a really difficult situation. The name of the movie was Inside Job, by the way.
Okay.
And so,
not to be confused with Inside Man, which is a great movie, but starring a completely different made-up cast.
Yeah. But yeah. So, which that documentary really gets into the heart of greed and risk taking. And
and sometimes I get into debates with friends and people of wondering, like, we talk about greed, but sometimes I feel like the amount of accumulated wealth people have is actually closer to gluttony than greed. And yet gluttony seems to be only reserved for the excessiveness when it comes to like eating. And not even that someone's excessively eating, is that they visibly are, like, you can visibly see the excessiveness, because there's some people who can obsessively do lots of things, but you don't see it visibly on their body necessarily. And so, for whatever reason, they have a high metabolism or a good plastic surgeon. I don't know. Like, I don't have any idea like what people do, but I just don't feel like we talk about the accumulation of and the excessiveness of accumulating more wealth than one can possibly use in their lifetime. I don't feel like media wise it gets talked about as either greed or gluttony. It's only greed if you use it negatively. It's not greed if you're just keeping it for yourself. I mean, it's like, no, they earned that. And you're like, but how did they earn it? And why do we allow somebody to accumulate that much stuff why does the system allow that when there are so many people who are suffering? That there are times where I'm like, Elon, can you just give me $5 million? I could change my whole community with $5 million. Like, I could build the exact housing cooperation and solve housing insecurity in my town with that money. And it's literally nothing for him. It's like nothing. And in my lifetime, I will not earn $5 million. Like,
you and me both. And while we're talking about greed, I mean, don't be fooled by this background. This is not where I live.
it isn't, but it is where you have had the privilege of studying, which I appreciate. That
Yeah.
there's a lot of great work that came out of time well spent in that place. But I think I wonder, like, when we don't have these kind of if we don't have critical conversations about who controls the information that we receive, who benefits from things staying the way they are. I think it gets, and I don't know that I see those as political so much as I see them as like things, thoughtful. Yes, like And so I don't know how you've balanced that over the years, and how you proceed in the current climate that we're in.
Yeah, I think it's going to be severely difficult. I mean, it's I think it was, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but you might recall during the political election season, I think of 2012 or 2016, maybe 2016, Facebook came under attack,
Yeah.
and Facebook was using a company doing its analytics called Cambridge Analytica,
Mhm.
and its CEO, of course, he was indicted over over a bunch of stuff, but one of his quotes was, it does not have to be true. You just have to make people believe it.
Oof.
And so that's what, and so these algorithms and the proliferation of false information and all of that kind of stuff, based on Facebook's algorithms on what it is, it seems to get your attention. I mean, this is what we're facing, and which is contributing to the hyperpartisanism that we have, and the divisions in the church. We have churches that are split,
Yep.
uh, politically split, and pastors who are afraid to, they have to tiptoe around the issues because they don't want to upset one half. Because they upset one half, they'll make the other half happy, or vice versa, and then
Right.
puts their job in jeopardy. Despite the fact they've been called by God. So, it's tough as far as the role of the church and in society. I see no I see no positive way forward, unfortunately. I don't want to be pessimistic or, a Daisy, downer or whatever, but I honestly see no positive way forward. And so I fear for what the future of so I have three grandchildren. The youngest is 7. So 20 years from now, when he's 27 and his sister is 30,
What
what's
does it look
not
like?
even going to look like? you
Yeah.
know they'll probably have kids by then, and what are they going to be having
Yeah,
to
and even now my children sometimes talk about, like, they don't know that it's responsible to bring children into this world, and they're 14 and 10. I'm like, you're not bringing kids in the world anytime soon, but like, also, like, how is in the world are you having this conversation? I feel like there are lots of people who maybe could make that choice that aren't having this, they're not talking about it, or they're not thinking about what's the responsible way forward. And of course, I would love more children in the world. I mean, I'm not gonna, I hope my kids have kids eventually, not now, not anytime soon, but like eventually. I would love to be a grandparent, but I do think, if we can't see anything but the if what we're seeing is the discourse and whatever, and not a clear path to get through it, it becomes hard to, then what sort of futures are we envisioning? Because I think if we can't see it, it gets harder to get there. If we're not, which doesn't mean we'll be there when the vision comes into reality, right? We might not be there when that vision comes into reality. But I still, I guess, feel this strong need to help my children see a future that isn't as abysmal as the one I might be seeing, right? Um, and that's hard, because how do you do that and not be lying in some essence, or like being optimistic just for optimism's sake? I think that becomes a hard balancing line. But then I wonder, like, where does it begin? Does it start from all of us shutting down all our subscription services and agreeing to be uncomfortable? Is that like a modern day, uh, 1 year boycott of the Montgomery bus system, so that you cripple the economy and then they have to pay attention to you? Like, I don't know what it looks like. And there are times I get asked every single day I open my apps for like Amazon Music or Spotify if I want to pay for the service and no longer hear commercials. And I'm like, no, I'll listen to commercials. I can't pay for one more thing. I can't pay for one more thing. Not on a regular everyday basis. Like I make my own coffee. I'm not paying for that. Um, I don't know the way in which it starts, but some of it has to be our we have to be willing. I don't think it's going to change if all of us aren't willing to be a little uncomfortable. And that includes us from the pulpit having conversations that make other people uncomfortable. Because it's not like I get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations.
Mhm. Right, right. Yeah, I had a friend who's now retired, a Presbyterian pastor. He says, if he preached on racism on Sunday or anything regarding economic justice, you know, uh, he guaranteed to get a call on Monday.
Yeah.
I remember I filled in for him 1 month, and in one of my sermons, I don't remember exactly what it was I preached about, but that following week, I had a visit from one of my seminary professors, uh, who was a member of that church, who was sent. Some folks were complaining, and so they sent him to have
Mm-hmm.
a conversation with me. You know, and although there were others who appreciated the message, it sort of disturbed some other people, so they decided to send somebody to have a conversation with me. So so yeah, I don't run away from that type of controversy. I love it. So because obviously I must be disturbing. So
Right. I mean, the thing is that sometimes what I'm saying might be disturbing, but it also has disturbed me, which is why I'm even bringing it up, right? Like, if it didn't disturb me, I guess I wouldn't have. I brought it up. I think there are times where, like I am white. My husband is black and from Africa. Our children are biracial, though they both I prefer to be identified as Black Americans. So that's how I'll identify them. And a lot of that is because that's what the culture tells them, right? The culture tells them they're Black Americans, oftentimes, and then not oftentimes, like definitely. But sometimes when you talk about these things, and I talk about these things, I think it's like I'm not talking about them because it's only relevant to me. There's a part that I have begun talking about this stuff more because I see it differently play out in my home, right? My conversations in my home are very different than some of the conversations growing up. I mean, I grew up in an all white household. No one came home and talked. Well, like we talked about race in my house, but not. Nobody in my household was racially discriminated against. It would all be in relation to someone else. It's not the same thing as having your child come home and say, somebody asked me if they could say the N word today, which my brother gave a great response to was tell your kids that to tell those people they can say it as often as they hear them say it, which is never. So like that's how often they also can say it, that they can feel invited to say it as often as my son say the word. But it's changed the like what's at stake, right? Because now the I mean, I was doing work on racism prior to both being married and having my family, but the work has definitely got more personal. um, you know, but it's always been important. It's just more personal now, but it's always been important. And but yeah, I guess I had not really thought about it doesn't matter your environment. Sometimes people are like, I don't want to talk about this is not a topic I want to talk about when I come to church on Sunday, period. Even
yeah,
though it's in the texts.
yeah, yeah. I mean, because people don't want to be. I actually had somebody in one of my congregations who said to me, after service, they want to start seeing my sermons beforehand. I looked at them as if they had an eye in the middle of their forehead, and just walked away. Like, you got to be out of your cotton picking mind.
It's not
So,
happening.
not happening here. But yeah, what's the slogan? We comfort the uncomfortable.
Comfort the afflicted and afflict the uncomfortable.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that was a needle point in my house growing up. It's still in my house. So my mom had that as a needle point in our hallway growing up, right?
Yeah. So, and that's how I approach ministry, and I, as you said, we're often uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The word convicts us as much as it convicts anybody else, and so because we're all sinners.
Right. It's not like I have a calling, but I don't have like some sort of special protective bubble that has made me not be affected by the things that, right, that God puts out in this world. I mean, I hope I get affected by it. I mean, otherwise, what's the point, right? If I'm not affected by the stuff that I encounter on a daily basis, I hope at the end of the day I have more positive interactions than negative ones, but
Sure.
if I'm not affected, then what? I'm a zombie. It's just not not really the way I wish to proceed through this world.
Yeah. So I resort to jazz and go on jazz cruises to sort of find my centering place. And
Yeah. I think tethers like that, grounding ourselves is really important in whatever ways that we do it, that gives us the courage or the respite we need to continue to be uncomfortable. So this brings us to the end of the hour, and my final question, which isn't often appreciated, but I ask it anyway because that's how I roll. But but where you can see my Care Bear here, but they the emblem of the '80s, and even what made me start thinking about them again wasn't because I suddenly came across my old Care Bear in my childhood, because I didn't have a Care Bear in my childhood. I didn't have an actual Care Bear growing up. Was Dave Chappelle talked about the Care Bears, and that these were cartoons where they just exploded love out into the universe. And it made me think about them again, and then continue to think about them, and how I see them very much as like as an emblem for how we could, those gifts that were given by the Holy Spirit to shine out that love into the world. And so, John, if you were a Care Bear, what color Care Bear would you be, and what core emblem would be on your belly that you would project out into God's world?
Oh, so although my kids kind of watched the Care Bears, I didn't really follow them that much. But color, I would say purple, because not because yours is, but
Yeah, I
purple.
was like, because you're mimicking mine. Yeah, no.
The colors. My so just a quick side note. At this church, I was told that their colors are blue and white. I was like, oh, that's nice. And so for the anniversary, they were decorating things in blue and white, didn't think anything of it. And so one day, somebody said, do you know why the colors of the church are blue and white? I'm like, no. This is because one of the pastors, that was the color of his fraternity. So I'm like, oh, so this, oh, well, it ain't my favorite colors, so I like purple
Yeah.
because it's not a royalty. So anyway, so now the church color is purple and white. Uh,
That's
so
awesome.
so it would be a purple Care Bear.
Yeah.
That's my favorite color, and it's also a color of royalty, which I would align with the kingship of Christ.
Right.
Um, but as far as an emblem, Um, I mean, this is kind of um I guess it would be, I'm young enough to remember the 60s, and the peace symbol that was going around everywhere,
Right.
I guess it would be the peace symbol because, I hope that we could live and operate and play, in a peaceful and worship in a peaceful atmosphere.
Yeah.
So I think that would probably be my emblem.
Nice. Very, very nice. Well, it has been a pleasure chatting with you as always, and I look forward to many other conversations with you in the future. But thanks for taking the time and dropping some knowledge on us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Let's catch up again.
All right. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you, Leah.